Okay. Well, look, thank you. I'm actually joining you from Brussels, and I'm delighted to have this chance to speak to this important meeting. The title I was asked, or I chose to speak on, is Building on the Outcome of the UN Food Systems Summit. And I wanted to really talk about it in three parts. Firstly, I think it's important to look at the key changes in international food systems over the past decade. I think that's the background to the Food Systems Summit. Assess the outcomes of the summit itself, and then talk about the fact that the world has changed since the summit. Particularly the invasion by Russia of Ukraine has had a whole series of important consequences, which I want to refer to and draw some conclusions from. So that's the basic structure of what I want to talk about. If we're setting the scene before the summit, which took place in 2021, I think there's a few things to refer to. The two important things from 2015 were the agreement of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. Now, it became clear within a few years of those landmark agreements that, in fact, they were at an early stage already off track. And that was the background to, they were off track in a number of ways, but in one in particular, we had seen that the number of hungry people in the world, which had been declining year by year over many, many years, began to move upwards again. They moved upwards really for two main reasons: conflict and climate. And the other thing I think that's important to draw attention to is that in the last 7 to 8 years, there's been an increasing recognition that when we're talking about malnutrition, we're not only talking about undernutrition, we're talking about the other two dimensions of malnutrition as well: micronutrient deficiencies and overweight and obesity. And they were bringing those factors together, and the fact that the two agreements were off track. That was the background to the UN Secretary General in 2019 summoning or calling the Food Systems Summit. Now, it didn't happen when it was supposed to happen in 2020 because of COVID, but it did happen in 2021. And the core motivation, when you boil it down, was that the Food Systems Summit, there was a recognition that sustainable food systems and their implementation were key to any chance of achieving the SDGs by 2030. Now, the process for this UN summit was unusual in that it wasn't just a matter of governments and states coming together. There was a much wider range of voices, including civil society, the private sector, youth, indigenous people, all were involved. A notable feature was the establishment of what were called food systems dialogues, and in the lead up to the summit, over a 6 to 8 month period, there were about 1,000 dialogues held all over the world. So the summit, when it took place, it was a big set piece event, but somebody had to draw conclusions, and the person who did that was the UN Secretary General. And a couple of the things that I just want to focus on. Firstly, he said, quote, "Across the SDGs, the world has established clear and ambitious goals for food systems. We need to move boldly now to implement the transformative actions to achieve the goals we have." But the notable thing was that at the summit, 163 member states made statements of their own policy, and 108 of them said that they were submitting what were called national pathways for food systems transformation. Now, this is striking and notable because it really is only in recent years that this concept of food systems as such has become more common. Before then, I would say up to 10 years ago in particular, ministries of agriculture were mainly concerned with planning for their own sector, with increasing production of food and farmers' income being their dominant focus. But so the summit was important in terms of achieving a much wider acceptance of this concept of a systems approach, acknowledging the links between the systems for health, ecology and climate, science and innovation, and economics and governance. So the other critical thing was that it was acknowledged that if action was to be achieved, it had to happen at country level by governments in their own local contexts. So if we were to look at, and then the other thing was there was an agreed set of 5 action areas, which were to be the centerpiece of moving towards transforming food systems. And these 5 were as follows. Number 1, nourish all people. Number 2, boost nature-based solutions. Number 3, advance equitable livelihoods, decent work and empowered communities. Number 4, build resilience to vulnerabilities, shocks and stresses. And that really, of course, is central to our deliberations today. And number 5, accelerate the means of implementation. So if one is to take an objective view of what the summit achieved, I think there are indeed a number of positives, and then there are some areas where perhaps more progress should have been achieved. On the positive front, we're getting a political and social engagement about food systems as such, and that at a larger scale. Secondly, an acceptance that there should be a food system focus in future planning. Third, that there has to be, in any vision of the future, a key role for science. The work of the scientific group led by Joachim von Braun produced, I think, a major assessment of where science is at the moment and where the possibilities for science are going into the future. The issue, then, number 4, an agreement that there needs to be an action agenda at each country level, along with national level implementation. What might be classified as unfinished business, or areas where there perhaps was acknowledgement but not sufficient progress? And again, I'll pick out 4 areas. Firstly, the need to strengthen capacities for national level implementation in emerging economies. This issue of capacity is of absolutely crucial importance if we're to make progress. Secondly, there was probably not a sufficient focus on the need for the finance agenda to deliver a lot of the ambitious things that were being spoken about. Thirdly, the establishment of improved science policy society interfaces. This is a topic that I was chairing a committee for the European Commission on this question about science policy society interfaces. What this really means in more simple language, I think, is that you need both the policies and the institutions to achieve anything if you're thinking about food systems transformation. And institutions, of course, don't happen overnight. They have to be built up gradually, etc. But the acknowledgement of the importance of institutions, I think, just needs to be very established. And then the other area where, if we are talking about food systems, we are actually looking at where where you can find synergies with climate policy, with trade policy, etc. Where you can find synergies, and if you're talking about synergies, you're actually inevitably having to identify areas where there are trade-offs and compromises can also come into play. So that really was, I think, I hope, a reasonably fair assessment of the summit and its achievements and its, perhaps in certain cases, shortcomings. But overall, I think it was an important area. Now, one of the things that, in terms of, if we're talking about institutions, what it also decided upon, and which has subsequently been established afterwards, was the development of what's called a coordination hub, which is housed in FAO. And the hub has started its work. And its purpose is to act as a catalyst inside the UN system in relation to food systems and the 2030 agenda. And it will take on essential coordination functions to bring about food systems knowledge and expertise from diverse constituencies to support national progress on the SDGs in response to country priorities. Again, coming back to this critical issue that if we achieve something, it has to be led by governments in their own countries, taking account of their own circumstances. And the other area, the main role is to support countries to further develop and or implement their national food systems transformation pathways, relevant dialogues and other processes through the coordination of technical and policy support. Now, it was also recognized that if the momentum that was achieved in both the lead up and the holding of the Food System Summit is to be maintained, there has to be some kind of review process. And so there is envisaged in 2023, 2 years after the summit, a stocktake of where the process has got to and where countries have got to in their own ambition. So that's a very important reporting back process. But now we move to the reality that the events of February of this year has changed so many things. And it has changed, it obviously has caused major disruption at many different levels. It's given rise to worldwide inflation, which is causing its own problems. And in fact, we are talking here about a triple challenge, a challenge of food, energy, and finance. And the UN has recognized the scale of that challenge and has set up a global crisis group to analyze the problem and to come up with solutions to it. So that is an important crisis group. One of the co-chairs of it is David Nabarro, who has many experiences of dealing with crises of many different forms. But we are talking about, when we look at the short-term impact of this crisis, I want to point out a number of things that have happened. Firstly, there is a very large number of food insecure people already in 2022, an increase estimated by the UN of 47 million, bringing it up to 323 million by the end of this year. That's really the immediate factor in this year. But looking to 2023, 1 year on, there is the potential of a wider food crisis, and there's two factors which may lead to that or work towards it, and that is declining fertilizer affordability and rising export restrictions. So this year's food crisis is an issue of access to food, but next year could indeed become a crisis of the availability of food. And the group looking at the crisis at the moment have stated that if the war continues and high prices for grain and fertilizers persist into the next planting season, food availability will be reduced at the worst possible time, and the present crisis in corn, wheat, and vegetable oil could extend to other staples, especially rice, affecting billions more people. So that is the real consequence in the short term. And there's a particular problem, obviously, developing in the Horn of Africa, which, if it's not addressed fully, could lead to very large-scale loss of life, I'm afraid. But the crisis has also given rise to a couple of other things which are relevant to the longer term. And two factors in particular. This crisis has brought home the degree to which many countries, particularly in North Africa, the Middle East, and Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, are dependent on imports from Ukraine and Russia. And so if we're looking to the medium term and medium to longer term, and here I'm talking about, say, the period up to 2030, I think inevitably political leaders are going to have to move towards both reducing that import dependence that has developed and increasing their own share of domestic food produced. And when I talk about domestic, I'm actually talking not just about national level, I'm talking about regional level. There has to be an acknowledgement that this problem also, there's a regional dimension to solving this problem. But if that's the context that we are talking about, it seems to me that there is a real political opportunity here to advocate for greater priority for food and nutrition security, both at national and regional level. And that's the context, I think, in which people like ourselves who are have been probably advocating this for some time, but now there are objective political and economic reasons why we should be moving in this direction. And that, I think, is something we should look to. We should also look to the whole role of science in enabling this transition. And again, one of the lessons, of course, from COVID is that we have to think in terms of food systems with much greater resilience. And that should be part of our short, medium, and long-term agenda. So, Jerry, I'll leave it at that. I hope it's an attempt to give, I think, an overview of what happened at the summit and some of the positive things in particular that came out of the summit, but acknowledging that really the circumstances have been dramatically changed by the Ukrainian crisis.